Welcome to Ground Control and part 2 of the review on the XK A160 J3 Skylark Cub. It's a mouthful. Alright, so if you guys watched the first part of the review part 1, we went over the assembly, you got to see the Maiden Flight, and the plane performed well in the Maiden Flight. Now I kept the throttle, I don't think I went below 45% throttle at any point in time, when I was making my turns I was somewhere around 50 to 60% throttle making those turns. I didn't have any problems. I did put some additional flights on this plane. I was able to induce the spiral of death that I have seen with other reviewers. So you know, when I first saw other reviewers flying it and saw the problems that they were having with the plane, the first thing that came to mind was either a communications error, you know, a radio communication error with the plane, or a gyro-induced stall. Okay, so after having induced that stall myself, I no longer believe those two things to be true. I believe that it is an actual tip stall. I believe at least mine were actual tip stalls. You know, where I got to the point where the plane was just flying too slow, didn't have enough lift, and when this plane stalls, it dramatically dips a wing. If you have enough altitude, you can recover from it. If you don't have enough altitude, well, at least I wasn't able to recover from it. One of the spirals of death that I had was I had it in 3D mode. And, you know, I thought the plane felt a little tail heavy when I was flying it on the Maiden Flight because it wanted to keep climbing, and I had the elevator in a completely neutral position. And so when I was doing my Maiden Flight, I had to input maximum down trim on the transmitter to keep the plane from climbing. So after the Maiden Flight, when I was doing additional test flights with it, I put it in 3D mode and it immediately started climbing. So I knew the balance of the plane was in fact off. So I think there are two things that are contributing to the tip stalls that I've seen in the other reviews and also in the additional test flights that I performed on it. Number one, the plane is significantly tail heavy. And number two, with the default linkage setup for the control rod on the rudder, there was a tremendous amount of rudder that was being mixed in whenever you made a turn in 6G mode, whether it was in low rate or whether it was in high rate. And if you watch the turns of the plane, I mean, it was almost, it barely banked the wing, and it was just basically spinning the plane around on a vertical axis because there was so much rudder input into it. So when you have a plane that is significantly tail heavy and it has a lot of rudder being input into the turns, in my opinion, that is a recipe for a tip stall, especially if you're trying to fly it very slowly. Now, as long as I was keeping the throttle up between 50 to 60% cruising speed, when I was making those turns, as you saw in the Maiden Flight, I didn't have a single problem with it. It didn't even attempt a tip stall. But as I did my additional test flights and tried to fly it slower and slower and slower, if I got down below about 45% throttle, it would tip stall. So what I did after those test flights was I moved the linkage at the rudder control horn from the center position to the outside position. Now luckily, when I checked the control arm on the servo for the rudder, it was on the outer hole. There's only 2 holes on that servo arm. So I also removed the control horn and moved the linkage to the inside hole on the servo arm so that would dampen the rudder even more. Now I also found that the elevator was a little twitchy at certain points when I was flying it, so I moved the control rod on the elevator control horn from the center hole to the bottom hole, and then after that that softened the elevator up enough that I didn't have any problems with the elevator being twitchy after that. It felt pretty smooth. So the throttle also seemed a little abrupt at half throttle. Like if you went below 45% throttle, the throttle decreased much more than it should have. And so between that 40 to 45% throttle, it seemed like it wasn't linear, you know, like it was ramping up too quickly, you know, from 50%, 45% throttle on up to full throttle, it felt linear. But when you went below 40 to 45% throttle, it had almost like a power band there. So that also makes it a little bit difficult to prevent tip stalls when you get down below 45% throttle. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think in description it said that the CG was between 55 to 65 millimeters. Okay, well, 55 to 65 millimeters would put you about 10 millimeters away from where the aileron starts. That is not correct. Now, when I was out flying, my CG was just about where the control horn, well, actually about on the back side of where the servo control arm is. It was on the back side of that. What I did was I added nose weight to it to get my CG just in front of the control arm here. Now the root chord on the main wing is 97 millimeters. Where I have my CG located right now is at 33 millimeters back from the leading edge of the wing, which happens to be 34% of the root chord, which I think is where that CG should be. And with that load located there, and I've added 5 grams of nose weight to this plane, and at 33 millimeters back, or 34% of the root chord, that gives me a completely neutral balance on this plane now. And I think that's where the CG needs to be. So now that I have added some nose weight to it, gotten the CG where I believe it actually needs to be, that should take care of the tail heavy condition on the plane. And I have softened up the rudder as much as I can. So we will take it out and test it and see what kind of benefit we get from that. But now that we won't have as much rudder input on the turns, and we're not going to have a tail heavy condition, we should be able to fly this plane more slowly without getting a dramatic tip stall out of it. The other thing, this plane, the all-up weight on this plane with the stock battery, that's without adding any nose weight, was 174.2 grams. Now I think that's a fairly decent weight, you know, kind of heavy for a plane this size. So, you know, the higher the wing loading on a plane, the more quickly you've got to fly it without it stalling. That's true of any aircraft. So, and I think the wing loading on this is heavier, you know, is higher. The wing loading on this is higher than some other planes that I've flown of about the same size. So that's something to consider too, is with higher wing loading, you can't fly it as slowly without stalling the plane. And once you stall it, there's not much the gyro can do. You know, you either have lift or you don't have lift. So I believe that's what's going on with this plane. High wing loading, tail heavy condition, too much rudder in the turn. And I think that's why those planes were so susceptible to tip stalls. So now that I've made those adjustments, there was one other thing that I noticed about this, is when I inserted the battery into the battery bay, the battery was a little canted. It wasn't setting flat. So there was some bad molding right here where the battery bumps up against the back side of the fuselage where the motor mount is. So I took the prop off, I took the cowling off, I cut out that foam that shouldn't have been there so that I could slide the battery further into the battery bay. Because when I went out and did the maiden flight, I couldn't push the battery far enough forward without struggling to get the battery cover on it. So once I cut out that foam that was left over from the molding, shouldn't have been there. Once I cut that out, I was able to move the battery probably 5 to 10 millimeters further forward, which then made it really easy to get the battery cover on, the battery bay cover back on. So that was something else. So I only have one battery that came with the plane. In the description it says it's a 2S 500 milliamp hour battery. The battery is actually stamped 600 milliamp hour, but I've got 4 of these 450s right here, these sheet of 450s, and that's what I did all my additional test flights with, was with these 450s. Now the Sheeta is about the same width and about the same depth, almost identical to the stock battery. But if you look at the difference in the height of the stock battery that came with it, I do believe that is a 500, not a 600 milliamp 2S LiPo, even though it is stamped at a 600. So the flight time, after the maiden flight, I looked at the voltage in the battery pack that was left. After the amount of flight time I put on it, and just cruising around like I was with the stock battery, you should be able to get 10 to 11 minutes of flight time, leaving 3.5 volts in the cell. Now the battery weighs 29.9 grams, or 29.8 grams on the stock battery. The Sheeta 450 here weighs 24.3, so it is what, 5.5 grams lighter than the stock battery. If you use the stock battery, you're going to need about 2.5 grams of nose weight, located right here behind this little black part of the plastic motor right here. That's where I've got the 2 pennies located for the Sheeta 450. And with the stock battery being 5.5 grams heavier, you're still going to need about 2.5 grams of nose weight to get your CG at 33 millimeters back from the leading edge of the wing. Okay, so with all that information and the adjustments that I've made to the plane, the nose weight that I've added, the CG I've got set, dampening of the rudder and the elevator, let's go back out and do a couple of test flights and see how it performs now. I'll see you out at the field.
All right, let's get it in the air now that we've made our adjustments. I've got it in 6G mode, low rate. Alright, and as you can see, we don't have quite as much rudder as we did before. I've softened up the rudder as much as I could. I've got some people walking out here, so I'm trying to stay away from them. And as soon as they clear the area, we'll bring it back around over here. Alright, let's walk out here. It's a little breezier out here now than it was before. Now, since I toned down the rudder, of course the turns are a much larger radius than they were before, but that should prevent those tip stalls. Now let's see if the balance is correct on it. Okay, so right there, I'm off the sticks. Now I didn't see it really climbing like it was before, and I don't have any trim in the transmitter right now. And we're going into the wind right now. Now, let's see if we can slow it down a little bit. And let's see if it tip stalls on us. That is low. Oh, there we go. Okay, so there, I had it at about 40% throttle. I had it at about 40% throttle, and it tip stalled. But if you notice, the tip stall was not nearly as dramatic as I had seen the tip stalls before. So about 45% throttle is about as low as you want to fly with this plane. We'll get it back in the air again. I was flying really slow, and it was losing altitude, and I was pulling back on the elevator to try and maintain altitude, and that was at 40% throttle. So it will tip stall below 45% throttle, but let me get a hold of this. But the tip stall was much less dramatic than it was before. It was still sitting on its wheels. Alright, so let's get it back in the air again. Okay, so right there, that's 50% throttle. We'll bring it back down again. It cruises around pretty quick at 50% throttle. I think one of the reasons that it's stalling below 45% throttle is that the throttle below 50% doesn't seem to be completely linear. You know, when you back off at 50% throttle, it dramatically decreases the RPM on the motor. So let's put it. Did you hear that? I mean, I'm at about 45% throttle now. And look how much more slowly it's flying with just 5% less throttle. And I would say with this plane, you don't want to fly any slower than that. That's going into the wind. Well, let's see. Let's see if it tip stalls on me again. That's pretty slow, but like I said, I think this plane has a little higher wing loading than some other planes that I have flown, and so it makes it more susceptible to tip stalls. So now I'm having to pull back on the elevator going downwind. Yeah, I'm going to have to push up the throttle to get it to turn. So 45% throttle is about as slow as you want to go with this plane. Okay, so now let's put it in high rate. Give it a little more throttle. Let's see what the turns are like in high rate. Well, I don't see a whole lot of difference in the turn radius between high rate and low rate. Maybe a little bit, but it's not real dramatic. But it's a nice cruising plane, but it is very susceptible to tip stalls at slow speed. You know, it's not, you know, something that you can recover from when this thing stalls, unless you got some altitude. Okay, so now let's just test that theory. Let's just test that theory. Let's gain some altitude and then slow it down and see if we can see what it looks like when it stalls. Okay, there we go. Do you see that? Do you see that tip stall? Now I throttled back up, I centered the stick, throttled it back up, and I was able to recover from it. But one reason I think is why I was able to recover from that fairly quickly is because, remember, it's constantly mixing in rudder, and when it's moving the ailerons to try and recover from that tip stall, it is putting in a lot of rudder at the same time, and I think that's why it wasn't able to recover. You know why the gyro wasn't able to recover from a tip stall. So, turn off my timer here. So I think, and there it started a tip stall right there. I slowed down a little bit too much. But I think that adjustment, number one, the adjustment on the CG, I think the CG is right now is right where it needs to be. And dampening that rudder by changing the control linkage on the control horn and on the servo arm makes the gyro able to more easily recover from a tip stall and allows me to recover from a tip stall. That was the first tip stall that I was able to completely recover from on this plane. That was my fourth, dramatic stall. So I think if you make these adjustments that I've made, get your CG where I have it set up, I think you're going to be okay with this plane. But there's no doubt in my mind that those two problems are what are contributing to those dramatic tip stalls. Tail heavy condition and way too much rudder. Alright, so let's see if we can bring it in without stalling it. I don't know. Can we do that? Oh, not there, I can't. I'm gonna make another run at it. I gotta remember that this has got a really shallow turn to it. Alright. Now let's see if we can turn and get over our landing zone here. Alright. So that's what I think. And that certainly improved recovery from a stall on this plane with some altitude. If you're low to the ground like I was, when it stalled over there, then you're not going to be able to recover from it, but it's not nearly as dramatic as it was, and it landed on its wheels instead of nosing in. So, alright, so I'm going to put another battery pack in it, and then we'll see how long I can hang on to it in 3D mode. That should be interesting. See you in a minute. Okay, I've got it in 6G mode, low rates for the launch, and then we'll gain some altitude and see how long I can hang on to it in 3D mode. Let's get it in the air. Boy, I wish they had a lanyard eyelet on this transmitter. Okay, let's gain some altitude. I am no good. Alright, that's 3D mode. I am no good in 3D mode, to tell you the truth. Wow, that was a slow roll. And the rudder is very dramatic in 3D mode. Not enough power to get a loop out of it. Alright, I saved myself there. Alright, so that's me in 3D mode. It's not very pretty, is it? Oh, 3D mode again. that is not pretty. Yeah, that is not pretty at all. Oh man, it just barely could perform a loop. Alright, I'm back in. I think I'm back in. Yeah, I'm back in stabilization mode. Okay, so that is my skill level in 3D mode. I know it's not very pretty. I wish they would have put a full manual mode on this instead of the 3D mode. Now, just because you're in stabilization mode doesn't mean that you can't use the rudder. Okay, because I've got it set up now where it's not going to input nearly as much rudder as it was. So you can input more rudder to make your turns sharper, like that. Now it looks like we have some wind up on top. Wind is supposed to pick up early this morning, and I already have more wind than I had for the review part 1. But yeah, you can still, even though it's in 6G mode, you can input a lot more rudder to make your turns tighter, like that. But a very fun plane in gyro mode. I don't care for the 3D mode at all. Yeah, you can get some really tight turns out of it by inputting additional rudder in 6G mode. Look at that. Yeah. I'm just casting it up, spinning it around. Well, I almost tip-sold it there, too much rudder. Okay, so let's bring it in one more time in the crosswind. We could use a little rudder here to get it turned. Pump. Okay.
Okay, so review part 2 and my conclusion on this plane. First, I wanted to talk about the adjustments that I made. I think you saw how much better behaved the plane was with the CG in the proper place. Depending on how you like the feel of your plane, I would set the CG somewhere between 30 to 35 millimeters. I have mine set at 33. It gives me a neutral balance on the plane on the CG, and it's very, very much better behaved with that balance for me. Toning down the rudder at the control horn and at the servo arm dramatically reduced the amount of rudder that this plane is putting in. Now, I was wrong about the nonlinear throttle. I ran it up once I got back just to test that, and it's not that the throttle is nonlinear. It's that the prop makes a lot more noise when you go above 50% throttle, and it makes it sound like it's spinning a lot faster. But it's actually very linear on the transmitter when I got back and I tested that. So, you know, just ignore that sound. It's not actually you know, you're not actually getting nonlinear throttle below 50% throttle. It's just that it's noisier above 50% throttle. My recommendation for this plane is with the adjustments that I've made, cruising around at 50% throttle. At 45% throttle, you're really on the edge of a tip stall. So you definitely don't want to go below 45% throttle. You can fly it at 45% throttle as long as you're level and you're going in a straight line, but when you make your turn, throttle it up to at least 50% throttle, and you'll be fine, as you saw. Also, you saw that when I was flying close to the ground and I kept the throttle at 45% the whole time until the battery started to fall off a little bit, it was cruising around at 45% throttle just fine. And then as the props, you know, started losing its speed because the battery was falling off a little bit, then it tip stalled. But when it tip stalled, it wasn't real dramatic like it had been, because the balance was good and the rudder was good. And when it tip stalled and went down, it landed on its wheels, so it didn't nose in. You also saw that when I gained altitude and deliberately stalled it, it dramatically dropped the wing, but I was able to recover. And I would say, I don't know, what do you think? I think it dropped probably between 15 to 20 feet before I had it leveled out again. So as long as you have some altitude, you'll be able to recover from those stalls. But the best thing to do is just keep your speed up so you don't create a stall to begin with. But what you might want to do is gain some altitude like I did and just practice, you know, practice forcing that stall and recovering from it, and that'll help you when you have an accidental stall. So so it flew great. I didn't have any problems slowing it down and bringing it in for a landing, because as long as you're not tilting those wings, you know, and getting as much lift as you can at slow speed with the wings nice and level, bring it in for a landing, you can slow it down quite a bit to bring it in for a landing. Now I have abused the heck out of it. I broke my cross members on my landing gear, and then today I broke the skirt support on the side of the landing gear, so I've got to fix that. But EPP foam is the most durable foam I've ever seen. So except for damaging the front landing gear a little bit, everything else is good to go. I haven't even broken a prop. So my conclusion on this plane: it's a very fun plane. I don't care for the 3D mode on any of those planes, including this one. And you saw how bad I was at 3D mode. I wish that XK would quit putting a 3D mode on their planes and put a full manual mode on there instead. I think that would be a lot better. But I don't recommend this as your first plane for the following reasons. Out of the box, it's considerably tail heavy. Out of the box, there's way too much rudder mixed in with the ailerons, and that needs to be adjusted. Your CG needs to be adjusted. I had to cut some foam out. I had to take the prop off and the cowling off to get to the foam that shouldn't have been there if you watch the review part 1 video. So I couldn't get the battery seated all the way because there was some foam in there that shouldn't have been there from, I guess, a bad mold. Or maybe it should have been cut out before they packed the plane up. But I had to cut that out. The fact that the plane doesn't have the best slow flight capability, or the slow flight capability that I would want to see before I recommended it as a first plane, that's the reason that I'm not recommending it as a first plane. I think, you know, that I will have a link in the show notes to a video I produced a while back with my favorite trainer planes. Those planes are the planes that I would recommend for your very first plane if you've never flown an RC plane before. This would make a good second or third plane, but you need to make the adjustments that I spoke about, and you have to realize that it's tail heavy out of the box, and you need to add some nose weight. So now that I know that that CG is good and I've got the proper amount of nose weight on there, I'll be making the nose weight permanent. I'll put it inside the cowling so you don't even see it. with the I like the weight of the 450 milliamp 2S LiPo rather than the 500 milliamp LiPo that came with it. Even with the 450 milliamp 2S LiPo that I've got in there, you should still be able to get 9 to 10 minutes of flight time cruising around with it. And even with the added weight that I have on the nose, it's 172.1 grams all up weight. So it's about 2.5 grams lighter than the plane is with the stock battery without the weight on the front of it. So, you know, makes it slightly lighter, a little less flight time, maybe a minute and a half less flight time, but I think that's a good trade-off, and will improve the slow flight capability ever so slightly. So that's my recommendation on this plane, a good second or third plane. It's a beautiful plane. They put a lot of detail in it, and the gyro works extremely well. It is still, even with all the adjustments, it is still a bit of a drama queen when it comes to stalls. So you need to make sure that you got about, you know, 15, 20 feet. I would say 25 feet. I would say 25 feet. If you're flying around at an altitude of 25 feet, you'll have an opportunity to recover from any stalls without any problem. Keep you from crashing it. So I hope you guys enjoyed the review. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the air.